by Skinner. 2.0 Introduction. The traditional view supports Hamlet's exclamation, "How like a god?" Pavlov, the behavioral scientist, emphasized, "How like a dog?" But that was a step forward. These lines are from the book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, by Boris Frederick Skinner. Did you smile as you read the above quotation? If you did, why? Oh, the lines are humorous, you would say. Professor Skinner would object immediately. It explains nothing, he would affirm, lines cannot be humorous by themselves. If you modify your answer and state that you were simply tickled by the contrast of man as God and man as dog, Skinner would accuse you of being vague and mentalist. Operant conditioning by Skinner. 19. Learning and cognitive theories of personality. 20. Analyze how you have learned to laugh in response to inconsistent stimuli, Skinner would suggest. What were the antecedents of your smile? What followed it? Did you, now or earlier, get any positive feedback after learning to laugh in response to incongruous ideas? Did the similarity of the letters used to spell God and dog add to your fun? How did you learn that when similar things connote the opposites it is funny? Would you still laugh if you get an electric shock after every smile? You learn to laugh, to cry, to love, to hate as a result of rewards and punishments, Skinner opines. You learn, from environmental feedback, every single habit and attitude that makes you what you are. You learn through getting rewards and punishments. The duty of a psychologist is to analyze behavior and to identify the environmental contingencies that made your learning possible. Nothing is granted, nothing is given just because you are born a human. You must make the tortuous journey of learning at each single step of life. If, as a scientist, you can observe these elements of learning in an individual and analyze the antecedents and consequence of each unit of behavior, Skinner asserts that you have moved a step forward. 2.1 Objectives. L. After going through this unit, you should be able to discuss the concept of operant conditioning. L. Describe Skinner's classic experiment on operant conditioning. Explain the concept of functional analysis of behavior. Discuss Skinner's view pertaining to human nature, psychopathology and social attitudes. Discuss the application of operant conditioning in psychotherapeutic settings, and critically evaluate Skinner's operant conditioning approach to personality. 2.2 Concept of operant behavior in operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner's 1904-1990 was an American. His experiments on operant conditioning won him worldwide fame. Skinner defined operant conditioning as the process of learning that elicits operant behavior. So, what is operant behavior? According to Skinner, there are two types of behaviors, namely respondent behavior and operant behavior. You blink your eye in response to a flash of light. This reflexive behavior is elicited directly by the environment. So this is respondent behavior, spontaneous response to stimuli. But most of our behaviors are not so simply generated by the environment. You are not forced by the environment to look at this book, to talk, to sing, and to eat. These behaviors are emitted by you, the individual. Through such behaviors, you operate upon the environment. These are called operant behaviors. You might argue that we eat because we are hungry, and so it cannot be operant behavior. But eating as a process is not a direct response to hunger, as is gastric secretion. To eat, you have to locate the bread on the plate on your table, stretch your hand, grab it and bring the hand back to your mouth, put the bread in your mouth and chew and swallow. How did you know that you have to go through this complicated chain of behavioral units to reduce the uncomfortable sensation in your stomach? You have seen from your experiences that if you put certain kinds of things in your mouth and chew and swallow it, your hunger pang reduces. This had been a rewarding experience for you. You have also seen that the food does not automatically jump into your mouth. You have to pick it up and put it in your mouth. Thus, a series of rewards have taught you this process of finding, picking and eating. Again, you would not grab the food by hand if it were burning hot. You had learned that the pain of touching something hot is unpleasant. The punishment had taught you to pick it with a fork. Skinner claims that we learn most of our operant behaviors through this kind of consequences. If the consequence is favorable, we tend to repeat the behavior. If the consequence is unpleasant, we tend to refrain from doing it. 2.3 Skinner's experiment on classical conditioning. Skinner is a young research scholar at Harvard University conducted a series of experiments on animals to formalize his idea of operant conditioning. Some of you may have heard of the Skinner box, which is a sort of mini laboratory for acquiring operant behavior. In this section you would learn how Skinner conducted his experiments with the help of this box and what its implications are for behavior modification. 2.3.1 The experiment. The Skinner box is a simple box used to condition operant behavior in animals. This box usually contains a lever, or some other device which must be manipulated to get some reward. In his classic experiment, Skinner placed a semi-starved rat in the box. There was a lever which, after being pressed, released a mechanism to deliver a pellet of food to the rat. Initially, the rat is engaged in a number of random behaviors like walking, sniffing and scratching. None of these help to get the food. At some point of time, the rat accidentally hit the lever and the food was delivered. Of course, for the semi-starved rat, this was a big reward. Skinner observed that after a few accidental manipulations of the lever, the rat started spending more time near the lever, and then deliberately pressed the lever whenever it was hungry. So now pressing the lever became a new operant for the rat. Skinner further noted that if the pressing of the lever did not deliver food any longer, the operant behavior by the rat decreased and gradually stopped altogether. This is known as experimental extinction of operant conditioning. You may note its similarity with the concept of extinction in classical conditioning that you learnt in the Unit 1. 2.3.2 Interpretations of the results of the experiment. You have now learnt about Skinner's experiment, but what does it imply? In Skinnerian terms, every random behavior that the rat demonstrated within the box was also some kind of operant behavior. But these have been conditioned in the rat prior to your working upon it. The rat had been rewarded earlier for each of these behaviors. For example, earlier, it had scratched a paper packet and food had spilled from it. But now, within the Skinner box, none of them succeeded to reduce its hunger. Then accidentally another behavior, pressing of lever, which was completely new for the rat, brought about the reward. The food served as the reinforcer to strengthen this new operant. As in successive trials, the newly acquired behavior continued to be rewarded, the probability of its occurrence also increased. Operant conditioning by Skinner. 21. Learning and cognitive theories of personality. 22. Skinner developed his thesis of environmental determination of behavior. The first pressing of the lever by the rat was accidental. But this accidental behavior could be shaped into a relatively long-lasting modification in behavioral repertoire by manipulating its consequences in a specified direction. One significant point in Skinner's view is that learning is determined by the consequences of the behavior and not by the antecedents. Antecedents provide the context, but consequences really decide whether the behavior would be conditioned or not. You may readily understand that this is a rather provocative statement and opens up a large number of possibilities for manipulation of human behavior. 2.3.3 Measuring operant behavior. Quantification of operant behavior was crucial to Skinner's work. He needed to demonstrate that through appropriate use of reward and punishment you can actually increase the probability of occurrence of a conditioned operant behavior. Therefore, Skinner introduced the rate of occurrence of the target behavior as the measure of operant conditioning. He simply counted how many times the learned behavior has taken place within a given time. In fact, he used the cumulative frequency of the operant behavior as the final indicator. If you put it in a graphical form, you will readily see whether the probability of the occurrence of that behavior has actually increased over time. Take for example, the lever pressing behavior of the rat which it learnt in 3 hours. Let us say we divide the total time in 3 equal units, 1 hour each. In the first hour the rat was more engaged in random behavior. At the end of the first hour it accidentally pressed the lever and food was delivered. During the second hour, it also pressed the lever 3 times more. Then it started staying close to the lever, and in the third and final hour pressed the lever deliberately 10 times. When the rat pressed the lever 10 times, it clearly indicated that the rat has learned that behavior which Skinner wanted it to learn, that is, pressing the lever when hungry in order to satiate the hunger. Self-assessment questions 1. What is an operant? Skinner's theory states that if stabilized E, increased E, decreased E, fed intended E, observed C. The number of reinforcements given for training E, the number. Point 4. Functional analysis of behavior. Skinner stated that psychology is as yet unprepared for theory building as we do not have enough data to justify a theory. Therefore, he suggested that instead of proposing a ready-made theory of personality, we should go for functional analysis of behavior. To conduct functional analysis of behavior, you must intensively observe the behavior of the organism and conduct repeated experiments to establish the relationship of a behavior with its antecedents and consequence. If during this observation, you hypothesize any inner state like thinking or feeling, Skinner would disapprove them as redundant. You are supposed to observe only what you can measure in terms of rate of occurrence. Thus, according to Skinner, the functional analysis of behavior must be done in terms of two observable things, the operant defined as specific observable behavior and the consequence that lies outside the organism in the environment. Skinner's main interest in functional analysis of behavior lies in its potential to divide complex chunks of behaviors in manageable smaller units. For example, your act of reading this paragraph. You can divide it in reading of letters, words and sentences. The discrete straight and curved lines make the letters. You had learnt it through earlier reward-punishment process. As you read letters, you may form words. Similarly, each word joins to make a meaningful sentence. All these have been conditioned into you in your childhood through manipulating consequences. So if you report your difficulty in reading this paragraph, based on functional analysis of behavior, you would analyze which part is problematic for you. Letters, words, sentences, and with appropriate reinforcement condition you can correct the problem and shape it your desired way. In fact, this is exactly what you would need to do with a child with learning disorder. 2.4.1 Shaping. Have you ever seen a potter making an earthen doll? Have you seen how he takes fistfuls of wet earth, makes a clumsy elongated mass around a bamboo or wooden frame, and then with the skill and quick pressure of his fingers gradually brings out the intended shape? You may not recognize at first what he is working about, but soon you recognize the head and body, the hands and legs separately. You may observe him working on the doll's face. You would see the specific parts emerging from the mask: the nose, the forehead, the cheek, the chin, the lips, even the parting of the hair. You recognize the eyes too. Soon it is a face waiting to be colored. The potter, through his skill, slowly but surely approximates the final shape by changing small aspects of the original shapeless lump. According to Skinner, animals and human beings' behavior are also shaped by the environment. Shaping is an extremely important concept in operant conditioning as it refers to the application of its principles of behavior modification. Shaping means modification of the organism's behavior to the experimenter's desired end. Shaping does not occur all in one go, Skinner says. It takes place only through successive approximations. Suppose you are trying to modify a child's behavior by selectively rewarding the response desired by you. Before the ultimate desired behavior is enacted, the child's usually engaged in numerous other behaviors which may be considered as steps to the final behavior. They are close to the target, but not the target per se. If these approximate target behaviors are rewarded, shaping is facilitated. Operant conditioning by Skinner. 23. Learning and cognitive theories of personality. 24. Skinner discovered this principle of successive approximation rather accidentally. He was conditioning a pigeon to swipe a ball with its beak movement, which in turn would release a food magazine. The pigeon was not lucky enough. After waiting for the accidental success to happen for a long time, Skinner was bored. So, just casually, he decided to reward any behavior that might lead toward the target behavior, even if it is as simple as glancing at the ball. As these approximate behaviors were successively rewarded, to Skinner's surprise, the total process was quickened. Very soon, the ball was caroming off the walls of the box as if the pigeon had been a champion squash player. Skinner, 1938, p. 38. Rewarding of the simpler step has automatically led to the next higher step and so on. This is successive approximation. How would you know which behaviors are approximating the target? Skinner proposed that you need to do the functional analysis of behavior for understanding and controlling shaping. This analysis will help you to identify the elements of the final behavior as well as the possible successive steps to it. For each small step you must identify the antecedents and consequence. The antecedent will lead to the next step and the consequent will reinforce it. This kind of breaking down of behavior into antecedent, behavior, consequent chain is famously known as ABC technique. As each step is rewarded or punished, the learner automatically proceeds to the next step. Thus, through successive approximation to the target, she finally reaches the desired behavior. This is, according to Skinner, the fundamental principle of shaping. Furthermore, for shaping, you need to deliver reinforcements and punishments in an intelligently predetermined manner. In the following subsections you would learn about different types of reinforcements and punishments. 2.4.2 Reinforcements in Operant Conditioning and its Schedules. In the Unit 1 on Classical Conditioning you have been acquainted with the concept of reinforcement. It is defined as those events, which through their absence or presence, increase the probability of the target behavior. In the context of operant conditioning also, reinforcement has a significant role. However, reinforcement takes on somewhat different meanings in classical and operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, reinforcement is identical with unconditioned stimulus. For Pavlov's dog, food was the UCS as well as positive reinforcer, and electric shock was the UCS and the negative reinforcer. But in operant conditioning, the concept of CS and UCS are not applicable, as we are concerned with shaping of target behavior. So here reinforcement comes separately as a consequence of desirable behavior. It simply serves to strengthen the response. The food pellet emerges only if the lever is pressed, and not otherwise. So it is contingent upon operant behavior and strengthens the same. Positive and negative reinforcement. As in classical conditioning, reinforcements can be positive and negative in operant conditioning also. Positive reinforcers are those pleasurable consequences of behavior that make the behavior more probable. Example is praise from the teacher after being able to tell the square root of 169. Negative reinforcers are those unpleasurable consequences of not producing the target behavior that makes the behavior more probable. For example, the teacher asks you the square root of 169 and looks with fiery eyes at you. He will continue to do it till you give the correct answer. By producing the desired response, you terminate the look, the negative reinforcer. Primary and secondary reinforcement. Reinforcements may be primary, that is concerned with our basic needs. Or it can be secondary or conditioned, acquiring its reinforcement value only through association with the primary reinforcer. Food is a primary reinforcer. But if you make me work for money or for sweet words, you are using the secondary or conditioned reinforcer. We can neither eat nor drink nor sleep money, yet we are all reinforced by money because of its symbolic value through association. The famous tale of King Midas actually highlights the significance of primary reinforcer food and water over the secondary one, gold. Schedules of reinforcement. You may wonder whether in operant conditioning we always reinforce the correct behavior. Does it work properly? What would happen if we decide to stop it? Indeed, you might think of your son whom you reinforce with a toffee for being a good boy, and after a few days, he just loses interest in the candy. He would neither be a good boy, nor would he care for your bribe. Can't the same happen with rats and pigeons? The Skinnerians also attended to this problem and suggested that proper conditioning depends on intelligent scheduling of reinforcement. You can schedule reinforcement for your operant conditioning experiment in various ways. Basically, it can be continuous or intermittent. In continuous reinforcement, the target behavior is reinforced every time it occurs. Just as you always gave a candy to your son if he behaved. Intermittent or partial reinforcement means you reinforce the target behavior at times, and not always. What will be the basis of intermittent reinforcement? It may be based on interval of time or ratio of responses. Each of these again may be subdivided in fixed or variable scheduling. Let us now consider the nature and example of each subtype of schedule of intermittent reinforcement. Interval schedule. Interval scheduling means that reinforcement would be given after a certain time interval following the target behavior. In fixed interval schedule of reinforcement, for example, you may decide to reinforce the rat's first lever pressing response after every 15 minutes. It is possible that within the 15 minutes the rat had pressed the lever twice. But you wait for the 15 minutes to pass and give the food pellet only after the first response after 15 minutes. Again you wait for 15 minutes irrespective of the rat's behavior. But you reward again the first desired response that occurs after the 15 minutes had elapsed. In variable interval schedule of reinforcement, the deliverance of the food pellet is varied randomly around an average time interval. For example, you may decide to reinforce the target behavior of your subject around an average of 12 minutes interval. You can reinforce at a random schedule of 5, 12, 7, 20 and 16 minutes, the average of these being 12. So you reward the first target response, then wait for 5 minutes and reinforce the immediate next target response. Then you wait for 12 minutes and again reinforce the next immediate target response that takes place and so on. You can go for a completely different set of random variations if you wish. Ratio schedule. Ratio schedule refers to reinforcing the target behavior after a specified number of behaviors. In fixed ratio schedule, you reinforce the target response after, say every 5 correct response, irrespective of the time elapsed. In variable ratio schedule, as in variable interval schedule, you reinforce the target behavior after an unpredictable number of responses, but around an average number of responses. Operant conditioning by Skinner. 25. Learning and cognitive theories of personality. 26. Rate of learning in different schedules. The rate of learning differs in these different schedules. In fixed interval schedules, greater target behavior is observed near the end of the schedule, but the rate falls down immediately after the delivery of the reward. The variable interval schedule produces a slow steady rate of response. In general, ratio scheduling produces better response than interval scheduling. Fixed ratio schedule results in a steady and high rate of response. The variable ratio scheduling has been found to be the best as it maintains a high level of expectation and thus produces a very high and steady rate of response. Examples of different schedules of reinforcement from real life. Let us consider some examples from our school days to understand the application of various schedules of reinforcements in human life. Every day and every time you greet a teacher by saying, "Good morning, teacher," you get a reply, "Good morning." This is continuous reinforcement. You know this pleasant interaction is always there for you if you behave. Now let us try a few examples of intermittent or partial reinforcement. Remember the happiness you felt during the last 10 minutes of the class. The bell for the end of class would sound after every 1 hour, and you would be released for a break. This is an example of fixed interval reinforcement. Suppose you love Madam B's classes, but she takes your class only when some regular teacher is absent. However, every week, usually 2 regular teachers are absent, and you get about 2 to 3 weekly classes of Madam B on an average. This is variable interval reinforcement. Now for ratio scheduling, consider your examination time. You have some questions which do not allow part marking. You have to answer all 3 components of the question and you get either 1 or 0 depending on whether you have done them all correct or not. So every 3 correct responses you earn a reward of 1 mark. This is a fixed ratio reinforcement. For variable ratio reinforcement, consider the most knowledgeable but moody teacher you had. On some occasions, she would simply grunt if you give the correct answer. But sometimes, when you happen to satisfy her by a brilliant stroke of idea, she would beam all over and heap praises on you. Getting a word of appreciation from her makes you feel special that day. Since her praise means a lot to you and you never know which answer would satisfy her most, you always try to give your best to her. Outside the school premise and in the adult world, gambling is one example of variable ratio reinforcement. So are adventures in unpredictable conditions. Have you seen Charlie Chaplin in A Gold Rush, or Omar Sharif in Mackina's Gold? Did you ever wonder why people went at all for such indefinite prospects? An answer lies in the effectiveness of variable ratio scheduling of reinforcements. You know that out of thousands, some excavations would be rewarded with heaps of gold. And since there is no fixed rule, who knows, you might be the chosen one. 2.4.3 Punishment. All of us have been punished sometime or other in school for being inattentive or disobedient. How far those punishments have been successful in controlling the unruly behavior? In the parlance of operant conditioning, punishment is that event or condition which, if consistently delivered following a response, will reduce the likelihood of the occurrence of that response. Each time you talk with your friend during the class, you would be required to remain standing for 5 minutes. The teacher expects that this will reduce the probability of your chatting with your friend while the class is going on. So punishment is an aversive consequence of undesired behavior. Like reinforcement, punishment can be positive or negative. Positive punishment is the situation when an unpleasant thing, presented as a consequence of a behavior, decreases the probability of that behavior. If you scold your child for her misbehavior, it is positive punishment. Negative punishment occurs when the withdrawal or removal of a pleasant thing as a consequence of a specific behavior decreases the probability of that behavior. If you do not greet your child your usual smiling way because of her misbehavior, it is negative punishment. You have already learned about negative reinforcement, which also uses aversive stimuli. Are negative reinforcement and punishment synonymous? Negative reinforcement is used to elicit a desired behavior. Pavlov wanted the dog to learn withdrawal of paw. The shock as an unpleasant stimulus was given and the dog learned to withdraw the paw. So in this case the shock was a negative reinforcer as it increased the probability of paw withdrawal. Punishment, on the other hand, is used to stop undesirable behavior. If we suppose that walking of the dog in the laboratory is an undesirable behavior and deliver the shock every time the dog starts walking, expectedly the dog's probability of walking would be reduced. In this instance, shock will be punishment. In other words, when negative reinforcer is given, you act in a desired way to stop the unpleasant condition. When punishment is given, you associate it with whatever undesirable thing you did before, and refrain from repeating it. Remember that negative reinforcement and punishment differ depending on their purpose. The same unpleasant stimulus of electric shock can be used as a negative reinforcer for one purpose and punishment for another. Controversy remains as to how effective punishment is. Traditional child rearing practices are often punishment-based. Spare the rod and spoil the child, they say. But don't we often see that the abused child becomes seasoned to beatings and continues with the disruptive behavior? Skinner himself was not too much in favor of punishment. He considered positive reinforcement as the best technique for training, and considered punishment to have too much side effects. Some recent researchers, however, have reported that punishment delivered without hostility into a measured amount in a consistent manner may bring about desired result without much harm. 2.4.4 Generalization and discrimination in operant conditioning. As in case of classical conditioning, you can have your subject's behavior generalized to situations similar to the conditioned one. You learned to wash your hands before taking food at home, and you generalized it at school. In fact, if it were not so, we had to condition each and every operant conditioning separately for every context. Discrimination is the opposite of generalization. Through manipulation of consequences, we learn to respond to one stimulus which is rewarded punished and not to a similar stimulus which is not rewarded not punished. For example, you talk and laugh when Mr. M is taking classes, but you think twice before moving your neck when Mr. N is in charge. Operant conditioning by Skinner. 27. Learning and cognitive theories of personality. Self-assessment questions 2. 1. Take the correct answer. A. Functional analysis of behavior means I. Specifying the functions of a behavior. E. A mathematical model of behavior. E. Establishing a relationship between organism and environment. IV. Establishing a relationship of behavior with antecedents and consequences. B. C. Shaping takes place through I. Successive approximation. E. Functional analysis of behavior. E. Operant conditioning. IV. Practice. Intermittent positive reinforcement means I. Reinforcing every correct response only. E. Reinforcing some of the correct responses and not all. E. Reinforcing some correct and some incorrect responses. IV. Suddenly stopping giving reinforcements. 2. Right, true, T, or false, F.A. Gambling is an example of variable interval schedule of reinforcement. B. ABC analysis stands for appropriate behavior control. C. Variable ratio scheduling is the best technique for learning through reinforcement. D. Negative punishment means punishing very hard. Opening parenthesis. Opening parenthesis. Opening parenthesis. Closing parenthesis. Closing parenthesis. Closing parenthesis. 2.5 Operant conditioning in human behavior. In the following sections you would learn about application of principles of operant conditioning in real life. 2.5.1 Skinner's view of human nature. Skinner considers the world as a large version of the Skinner box within which technology of behavior plays its role. You learn everything here through reinforcements and punishments. Skinner, in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 1971, presents his view of human existence as a series of learning processes. You may wonder what personality is from Skinner's point of view. Skinner does not use the word personality, but he speaks on human nature in general. According to Skinner, human being is completely determined by his conditioning history. There is nothing called free will. One does what one is reinforced to do. There is also no point in debating whether man is rational or irrational. Both are inner states, and hence outside the domain of scientific analysis of behavior. Skinner opines that human behavior is changeable, and this change constitutes what we think as personality growth. It does not occur from within, but from manipulation of reinforcements from outside. There is no mystery existence. It is completely objective and knowable through scientific investigation. We know a person so far we know her environmental contingencies. 28. Skinner also comments in his book that usually we think that those who manipulate human behavior are evil persons. Those who manipulate for evil purpose may be condemned. But manipulation of human behavior is something which cannot be avoided. Indeed, we have no other alternative than to be controlled and manipulated. 2.5.2 Psychopathology from operant conditioning perspective. From Skinnerian perspective, psychopathology is the resultant of faulty conditioning with improper reinforcement. No individual is sick, only she has not learned to elicit the right behavior at the right moment. Take the case of compulsion. Suppose the client needs to wash her hands with soap 30 times a day, otherwise she does not feel clean. Skinner would assume that cleaning is a correct response in some situations. But for this particular client, cleaning has been conditioned erroneously to situations where it is actually not required and has been overgeneralized. Depression from Skinner's perspective is absence of reinforcement from the environment. The quick fatigability of depression has been explained by Skinner as low rate of response as there had been too much withdrawal of positive reinforcers. Some of you may have seen children and adolescents with conduct disorder. Imagine a boy who demands a costly video game. When her parents object to the unreasonable demand, she threatens to destroy her school books. After some efforts to pacify the parents buy the game. Similar extortions continue. At one point he demands a costly mobile with many features. Unless he gets it, he would burn the wardrobe, he threatens. The distraught parents yield again. Now, he is a big boy, and he wants a car for her own use. If he is not given a car she would create problems for his mother. From a Skinnerian perspective such cases may be explained by reinforcement of the wrong behavior. Every time, from her childhood days, aggressive outburst and threat of violence had won him his desired object. Her antisocial trend has been positively reinforced. 2.5.3 Operant conditioning of social attitudes. Do you wear a particular ring whenever you go to face an interview? My little luck, you say indulgently. It may sober you up to learn that Skinner observed development of superstition in pigeons. He found that if reinforcements are completely unpredictable and any random behavior is accidentally reinforced, the pigeon may develop an association between the behavior and the reward. Suppose a pigeon was flapping its wings when the food pellet was given. If it accidentally occurs a few times, the pigeon would start flapping its wings whenever it is hungry. Do you believe in the ideals of a specific political party? You think you have enough justification. Skinner would say that it is not your much advocated rational self, but a mere series of conditioning that made you declare your affiliation to those ideals. If you are repeatedly rewarded for chanting a particular slogan, you will soon start believing in that slogan and chant it frequently. Operant conditioning by Skinner. 29. Learning and cognitive theories of personality. 2.6 Applications of SKINNERIAN. Principles to psychotherapy. You have already learned how psychopathology has been conceptualized by Skinner as faulty learning. From this premise, you may readily conclude that psychotherapy would consist of unlearning of the faulty conditioning and relearning of correct operands through appropriate reinforcement. In fact, the major bulk of behavior therapy depends on Skinnerian principles. You may observe the applications of Skinner's principles in behavior therapy at two stages. One is in setting and defining the targets of modification, and the second is in executing the change process itself. The basic requisite of behavior therapy is to identify the short-term and long-term targets by analyzing the maladaptive behavior. Essentially, you need to conduct the functional analysis of behavior for this purpose. If a child is brought to you for aggressive outbursts, you need to make a thorough record of her behavior from herself and from her informants. You need to identify the contexts of her unsocialized aggressive behavior, and identify the feedback she gets from her social environment. Difficult. You approach the small and easy targets first, reinforce the adaptive responses, and through the principles of shaping reach the final goal of changing her behavior. What kind of reinforcements should be given? While the reinforcements can be of different kinds, verbal and non-verbal, one particular mode of reinforcement has been closely linked with Skinnerian principle. This is known as token economy. This is most applicable for children and in patients under strict hospital supervision, in other words for those whose reinforcements can be maintained within a structured environment. In this method, plastic or paper tokens are given to the person for desirable behavior. Tokens are charged from the person for undesirable behavior. For example, during lunchtime you get 2 tokens for standing in line, 1 token for taking the plate and napkin in the correct order, 3 tokens for eating cleanly, and so on. If you grab food out of turn, 3 tokens are taken back. With the tokens you can buy candy, pictures, an hour out with a friend and other things you enjoy. An extensive application of token economy was conducted by Atho and Krasna, 1968, in a hospital setup, and considerable behavior gains were reported. Token economy is still found useful in training hyperactive children, children with mental retardation and developmental disorders. Self-assessment questions 3. 1. What is technology of behavior? Skinner thinks that human beings can escape manipulation by environment due to their free will. Open, closing parenthesis. B. C. In behavior therapy, easier and smaller targets should be opening parenthesis. Token economy is opening parenthesis, closing parenthesis, closing parenthesis. 2.7 Critical analysis of Skinner's approach to personality. Even within behavioral paradigm, Skinner's approach has been criticized for excessive emphasis on consequence and less on the stimulus. However, Skinner has been critiqued mainly from the cognitive perspective. Noam Chomsky, 1959, severely criticized Skinner's thesis by saying that his experiments were inapplicable to human beings, and the approach was scientistic but not scientific. Chomsky also accused Skinner of supporting a totalitarian political phase. That cognitive learning does exist was also proved through Edward Tolman's 1932 famous experiment on latent learning that demonstrates that learning is possible even without any reinforcer. The biological critics have observed that certain species are predisposed to learn certain types of things. Everything cannot be taught to every species. These criticisms limit the generalizability of Skinner's approach, but do not downgrade its impact in applied psychology. Indeed, if we use the Skinnerian principles judiciously, behavioral gains may be obtained in many areas of educational and clinical psychology. 2.8 Let us sum up. In this unit we have learnt about the concept of operant behavior and its conditioning. We now know about the basic experiment of Skinner where rats were conditioned to press a lever to obtain food, and this was done by manipulation of reinforcement. We have also learned Skinnerian principles of functional analysis of behavior and shaping through successive approximation. The nature of reinforcements and their schedules have been discussed in detail. We have learnt about punishment and the distinction between punishment and negative reinforcement. We have discussed Skinner's view of human nature as completely determined by reinforcements from the environment. We have also discussed the nature of psychopathology and social attitude formation from Skinner's point of view. We have learnt how Skinnerian principles can be used in behavior therapy, particularly in the context of token economy and timeout procedures. Finally, we engaged in a critical evaluation of Skinner's point of view. 2.9 Glossary. Operant conditioning. Functional analysis of behavior. Operant conditioning refers to a learning paradigm where the desired behavior is taught to the organism by discriminatively reinforcing the correct responses. In operant conditioning paradigm, functional analysis of behavior is the breaking down of the complex behavior in small units into operant conditioning by Skinner. 31. Learning and shaping. Cognitive theories of personality relate each unit of behavior to its antecedents and consequences. Shaping refers to the conditioning of a desired behavior through the technique of successive approximation. Here the behaviors approximating the final target are successively reinforced. Schedule of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement. Punishment. Token economy. In operant conditioning paradigm, schedule of reinforcement refers to the rate of reinforcement delivered in response to the correct responses. In operant conditioning paradigm, continuous reinforcement refers to delivering the reinforcement every time the correct response occurs. In operant conditioning paradigm, intermittent reinforcement refers to the non-continuous reinforcement of desired behavior based on a pre-designed schedule. It can be based on time interval or number of correct responses. It can also be at a fixed rate or a variable rate. In operant conditioning paradigm, punishment is the negative consequence of undesired behavior delivered by the experimenter to reduce probability of occurrence of that behavior. A technique in behavior therapy where the principles of reinforcement are used. Tokens are given to the clients for desired behavior and taken away for undesired behavior. Probability of occurrence of desired behavior is expected as it becomes associated with positive outcome of getting tokens. 2.10 Unit End Questions. 1. Describe with the help of Skinner's classic experiment the nature and principles of operant conditioning. 2. Discuss the role of functional analysis of behavior in operant conditioning. 3. Define shaping. Illustrate in this context the principle of successive approximation. 4. Discuss with suitable examples the different schedules of reinforcement. 5. Distinguish between negative reinforcement and punishment with examples from everyday life. 6. Discuss the Skinnerian view of human nature. 7. Discuss from Skinnerian perspective the genesis of psychopathology and its treatment. 32. 2.11 Suggested readings. Hall, C.S., Lindsay, G., Campbell, J.B., 1997 Theories of Personality. New York,